Good evening, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here in Kolkata with an awesome audience. There's a few people still trickling in at the back. So, well, it's a real pleasure because I have with me a personality who I actually don't have to introduce. But the problem is that there are many, many Shashi Tharoors that we can deal with. There's Shashi Tharoor, the UN diplomat. There's the Shashi Tharoor, the politician, the MP. There's Shashi Tharoor, the minister. And of course, there's Shashi Tharoor, the writer. And this evening is about Shashi Tharoor, the writer. So I'm sure we all would like to ask him a lot of questions about his new responsibilities. But today, we're going to focus on his writings. After all, this is a literary festival. And what I'm going to do is maybe we can have it, we will talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we can open it up to Q&A. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting questions that all of you will have. So what I will do is I will start right in the beginning because that is the easiest place to start. And I'm going to start with a book that some of you at least will have read. It is not one of the more famous books of Shashi's. It's called The $5 Smile. But I'm going to start with this because to understand Shashi as a writer, you need to understand this book because it's got about 14 stories that he wrote when he was a teenager and in university or just had started working. And not only does it have these early writings, he actually prefaces each one of them with a short paragraph where he explains what he was thinking when he was writing some of them. What were the circumstances, personal circumstances and worldview when he began writing these stories. And they're really very interesting. So just to clarify something that that the organizers had advertised this as 25 years of writing for Shashi. It's actually something like 50 years because I believe he began writing when he was 6 years old. He published his first stories when he was 10. I don't think any of the very early ones are here, but there are some here which from when he was about 15. And interestingly written when he was still living in Calcutta. So some of these stories are written as a teenager in Calcutta. One of them is based in Saturday Club. It's called When Bobby Chatterjee Got Drunk. Turned to Drink. And it's a quite a funny Woodhousian kind of story that you know he has here. So why don't I turn it over to Shashi? Why don't you give us some sense of your early years of writing? I mean, how did you begin at 6? I mean, that's a ridiculously young age to begin writing.
Well, I was, first of all, hello to everybody. Great to be in Kolkata, and I've only come for this, heading right back to work afterwards, but it's wonderful to see you all. Yeah, I mean, the fact is that I was an asthmatic child. And in those days, I'm afraid there was no television, there were no computers, Nintendo wasn't a gleam in an inventor's eye. Essentially, the only distraction available when you were lying in bed struggling to breathe and couldn't go to sleep as a result was to read. And so I read widely and indiscriminately, but I rapidly ran out of things to read. I read whichever of my parents' books I could understand, but I was the oldest child, so I didn't have elder brothers or sisters' books. And I was an inconveniently fast reader. So if I borrowed a book or two from the library, I'd finish them in the car on the way home. And then suddenly there I was. So I started writing out of necessity. It was a way of distracting myself in the only way I knew how. And my parents, particularly my father, did me the great honor of taking these scribbling seriously, having the stories typed up so they could be shared with friends. And in that process, I began to imagine myself as a writer. And again, I wouldn't have known how seriously to take that idea, except that my dad sent off a couple of my stories to newspapers and magazines when I was 10 years old, and they started getting published. So yes, Malvika, if she's here, it's not 25 years of publishing, it's 46 years of publishing that we're celebrating today, and 50 years of writing, yeah.
Awesome. So, as I read through your stories, of course there was a story based in, there were stories based in Calcutta. But then you can almost see you evolving because even the landscape changes. So, for instance, one of the stories in the middle of the collection is a story called The Professor's Daughter, which is sort of loosely based on, I suppose, Delhi University.
That's right.
And I was quite amused by the story because it's about a student in what was in those days perhaps a largely male-dominated university falling in love with a professor's daughter, probably the only available lady in the campus.
This is in an all-male college like the one I attended, and she was therefore the only suitable girl on the premises.
Girl, yes. So what I was wondering is that this tale actually comes up in, many others have written a similar story. In fact, Chetan Bhagat also has a story
somewhat
similar.
After me, I might add.
Yeah, yes. And it, of course, turns up in the movie, The Three Idiots. I was just wondering whether future generations will even understand the meaning of the story, given that if you went back to Delhi University today, there are in fact now, at least in North Campus, more women than men.
Correct, and in fact, my own college, St. Stephen's, which the atmosphere of which is evoked in that story, has been co-ed since I left it. So there have now been 3 decades almost, no, more than 3 decades of girls coming into St. Stephen's. So this entire atmosphere as described no longer exists and cannot be found again. No, I think that's a good thing on balance, that there are now, I think, there's been this valuable change of girls coming into education. And if you look at the sciences, one of the most remarkable things is the way in which women are doing well in the sciences. In my constituency, we have a couple of major scientific institutions. And you find the majority of the graduating class are female, and almost all the prize winners are female. This is the way in which Indian science is heading, and I suspect a lot of Indian education will go that way too.
So, of course, you have a few more stories which you seem to have written as you somewhat grew older. There's one which was a major prize-winning tale that you wrote, I think, when you were in New York, which is about the loneliness of a writer. So why have you given up writing short stories? You clearly enjoyed that.
I enjoyed it, but they're a lot of work for one thing. And you have to understand that short stories have a more limited shelf life than substantial novels, or indeed other books. I mean, my bigger challenge has been that if you look at my writing, I began principally as a fiction writer. Even those in this room are old enough to remember something like JS Magazine. I used to have short stories in there very often. But then what happened was that whereas 3 of my first 4 books were fiction, my last 4 books have all been non-fiction. There's been a total change in my emphasis because I've never been a full-time writer. In those days I was writing after schoolwork and homework and college work and so on, and then later after work at the United Nations. But as the responsibilities I was undertaking became more and more onerous, I found that one challenge with fiction is that you don't just need time, which is scarce enough for anybody who's got something else to do to earn their bread, as it were. You don't just need time, you need a space inside your head to create an alternative universe, to populate it with characters, incidents, snatches of dialogue that are as real to you, that have to be as real to you as those you're encountering in your daily life. But to be able to sustain that illusion, you need a certain amount of continuously inhabiting that universe, a certain number of hours a day, a certain number of days a week. If your life doesn't permit you that kind of continuity, and this illusion you've tried to create for yourself in the first place is interrupted all the time, it's very fragile, it smashes. And so I found that as I became busier and busier at work, and I was no longer in a job where I could come home at 8 o'clock and be pretty sure that no one from the office would bother me, but rather I was in jobs where after 8 o'clock at night crises would erupt and I would be the person to call, or that there would be urgent travels to undertake at the drop of a hat, or wars to be involved in and major crises, as happened in my UN career. Then my writing output began to be littered with failed attempts at fiction. Because I would start something, the spell would be broken, I'd try and pick up the threads a few weeks later, difficult to do, it wouldn't be so good, then the spell would be broken again, and finally you'd say, forget it, can't do it. Whereas non-fiction, I found, curiously lent itself to interruption. I was able even to sustain long intervals between putting down the last word of something and picking it up again, because if you like, life is conducted in non-fiction. We are all talking non-fiction all the time in our daily lives, and we are We are, in any job you do, you're writing notes or memoranda or whatever, you're writing non-fiction. So the ease with which you can return to that is very different from what it takes for the literary imagination to kick in, to the style, the concerns, the way people speak, what you're trying to do with the tone of a particular evocation in fiction. And so my balance shifted completely, and now of my 13 books, 9 are non-fiction, which is very much a reflection of the way in which my life has changed.
So should we say that we have to say goodbye to Tharoor, the fiction writer, for some time yet?
Well, I was going to say I hope not, because in fact last year, after the publication of Pax Indica, my last book on Indian foreign policy, I actually decided to embark on a novel, and I even signed with a publisher who is somewhere around these premises and who is probably very upset to hear this, but I had no sooner begun that I'd written barely 2 pages when I was made a minister. And in the 3 months since I've been a minister, I haven't written another word because, again, life doesn't permit it.
So that's why you write short stories.
Not really. Short stories require a fair amount of effort because in some ways to write the 14 short stories in this very slim book, you're conjuring up 14 different worlds, 14 sets of characters, 14 issues, circumstances, sets of dialogue. In this case, 14 different stylistic tones as well. So you can actually spend less effort in producing a book twice the size of that than you would in writing so many short stories.
I'll take that as advice, as somebody who actually does a job and attempts to write. So I should simply forget about attempting fiction.
No, don't forget. Each person has his own rhythm. And the one thing that I always tell writers who ask me, how should I go about writing is follow your own instincts, because there is no formula. There are writers who will plot out meticulously every stage, every scene, every chapter of the books they're writing. They will draw charts on the wall with lots of boxes. They will put down in each box what's going to happen, and they will write according to a plan. And then there are writers like me who feel that part of the joy of writing is discovering the story for myself as I write, which means that while writing I may discover that the story doesn't work, but I only find out by actually writing it. Yeah. So there are various ways of writing. There are people who wake up at the same time in a particular day to write for the same number of hours. There are others who write whenever the mood and circumstance permit. There are some who can't write without a stiff glass of whiskey by their side, and others who can't write without a hot cup of tea. I mean, everything is different, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to writing.
No,
so what might not work for me might work for you. Try it.
I write my stuff in Singapore Airlines because that's the only time I have without emails and other things.
When I wrote my book, The Great Indian Novel, which was my first novel, I mean, some of the circumstances of its composition, I mean, when I look back on it now, it was written at home on a computer. It was written on planes. The funniest circumstances in which bits of it were written were when I would take my wife shopping to the supermarket and we'd fail to find a parking. Right. So I would drop her at the supermarket. I had to be behind the wheel. And I would go and stand illegally somewhere waiting for the cops to shoo me away and scribble on a sheet of paper pressed against the steering wheel. I mean, these were the kinds of ways in which one composed in those circumstances. Whatever, works at a particular time.
So I'm going to attempt to reread the book and try and guess the bits that came from
the supermarket writing.
Supermarket writing. So in fact, I'm going to come to the Pax Indica because, you had written, of course, it was probably your PhD thesis, The Reasons of State in 1982. That's 10 years back. 20 years later, you write Pax Indica, which is on the same subject, foreign policy.
The 30 years between the two.
30 years later. So how have your ideas about Indian foreign policy evolved over 30 years?
Quite a bit. Reasons of State was basically my PhD thesis rehashed. And first of all, it looked backward. It was a study of how foreign policy was made, whereas Pax Indica is much more a study of the outcomes of foreign policy. Secondly, Reasons of State looked at a portrait of Indian foreign policy in the first 3 decades, and particularly the 3rd decade after independence, whereas Pax Indica looks at tomorrow, today and tomorrow, rather than going back historically. And finally, Pax Indica attempts to articulate a vision for India's place in a world that is very different from the world in which Reasons of State was written. Reasons of State was written at the height of the Cold War, just during and after the emergency, a very different India, where it was a study of personnel, practices, institutions in the making of policy. Pax Indica tries to look both at relationships with individual countries, but also to articulate a view of India in the 21st century. First of all, not so much as an internationalist alone, but as a member of parliament from a constituency which, despite being the capital of Kerala, is still predominantly rural. I do find myself asking how foreign policy matters to the ordinary fisherwoman in my constituency, and I conclude that it does matter, and I explain why. And particularly in this more globalized India of today, for younger readers, they're going to be in a far more internationally integrated world than the one in which I grew up, or even you grew up some years later. And therefore, I think for them, to be conscious of this is very important. Tomorrow, a globally informed citizenry is vital for India in a way that it simply wasn't when I first became interested in foreign policy. And I also want to talk about the changing world. I mean, look at India, for example, today. You know, we've been brought up on a diet of non-alignment. But I argue in the book that to some degree we are really moving to an era of multi-alignment, by which I mean that we're doing, if you take the metaphor of the World Wide Web, you know, the networked world of the 21st century, that reflects the globe as it is. It's countries connected to each other in different patterns for different purposes in various configurations, so that we can belong simultaneously to the non-aligned movement, which reflects our colonial history, and to the community of democracies alongside the very Western countries where we are, whom we are excoriating in the non-aligned movement. Or we can belong to the G77, which is the global trade union of developing countries, and to the G20, which is the global management of the global economy. Our foreign minister meets every year with the Russian and Chinese counterparts in what is called RIC. Then we add the Brazilians and the South Africans and we get BRICS. Then we take away the Russians and Chinese and we have IBSA for South-South cooperation. Or then we add the Chinese and don't add the Russians and we have BASIC for environmental negotiations. And India is the only country that belongs to each of these groupings, and not merely because our name conveniently begins with that indispensable element in every acronym, a vowel, but also because we have a useful contribution to make in all these forums, and these forums are relevant to us for the pursuit of our own national interests. So I try and articulate this vision of larger global role, larger global responsibility, and I believe in the 21st century, a country like India can make a valuable contribution to the stewardship of the global commons on everything from cyberspace to outer space. We have the technology, the resources, the capacity, and the political will to play a bigger role than we played when we first became independent. So it's a vision for India in that more activist frame in the 21st century.
In fact, while reading a book, I rediscovered that the non-aligned movement actually still exists. I mean, what are we not aligned to? I mean, surely we should change the name for this thing.
No, the idea, you see, when non-alignment came up as a concept, it was not aligned with either of the superpower blocks. Now it means not aligned with anybody. In other words, in both cases, it's an affirmation of our independence, what the scholars call our sovereign autonomy, which to some degree has become a bit of an obsession. Because in the days when our independence was fresh and hard fought and recently won, we were very anxious to safeguard it from the encroachments of others, particularly the former colonial powers. Today, no one can presume to threaten our sovereign autonomy. I think we should no longer use it as a straitjacket to limit our options, but rather as a springboard from which we can multiply our options.
Now, going back to this book, the last bit of the book is a farce. It's called, it's actually a farcical play called 22 Months of a Dog. And it's a political satire. And of course, in some ways, I can see building inside your head the great Indian novel slowly. So almost in some ways, it was building up. Now, the question is, now that you have been a politician, would you have been just as harsh on the politicians in your books?
No, listen, this is an unperformed play written by a very young man. In fact, when I was a teenager in Calcutta, I did write one-act plays that were performed. My parents belonged to an outfit called the Kala Parishad, and I wrote these one-act plays, and my friends and I performed them, and one of them in particular, one of my sisters was in Loretto House, and they performed in, got entered into an inter-school competition, and that got performed elsewhere. So for all I know, this script may still be running around somewhere. These have never been published, and I wouldn't know where to find them anymore. Right. This was the only full-length play I wrote, and as I say at the very beginning, it's not particularly original because it's based on the Russian writer Mikhail Bulgakov's The Heart of a Dog, which is a very, very famous satire. And I have converted this into a satirical play about the emergency, where the metaphors are pretty thinly veiled. So maybe that's where you got the great Indian novel connection from. As I said, it's never been performed. It's not very difficult to perform because since I had actually acted in plays throughout school and college, I was reasonably conscious of the basics of stagecraft. And I don't think there's anything in the script that would be very difficult or very expensive for an amateur theatre company to do. But political plays in English have never seemed to have had much resonance. They do in Indian languages. But this has, as I said, never been performed. But it's a play that has the glimmerings of some of my early thinking about politics, about democracy, about humor, about the use of metaphors to carry larger ideas, which do resurface in the Great Indian Novel.
In fact, I was going to go to the Great Indian Novel, and obviously it is also a sort of political satire, and you make very thinly disguised allusions to, great political figures of Indian history. But I wonder whether, if you had written it today, it would have been impossible. It would have caused a huge controversy. It would be banned from every literary meet or not. Do you think that would have happened?
Well, even at the time when it first came out, the wonderful old Khushwant Singh devoted an entire one-page column, I think it was in Sunday in those days, magazine, praising the book. But he said in that column, go out, rush out and buy this book immediately because it'll be banned within a week, which was not exactly the kind of review that a first-time novelist is looking for. But fortunately, he wasn't right. Maybe because in those days, our easily offended politicians weren't reading English language novels. So it survived. But Sanjeev is right that there is now an era of cultural intolerance that has dawned upon our society in ways that would threaten very much a book like that, or a book like my novel Riot, which deals more directly with some of the issues of intolerance in our society. And I have to say that it's very sad because in many ways we are living in an era of competitive intolerance, where each segment of our society seems to take pride in being more easily offended than the next. And I honestly wish that we actually had more competitive tolerance, where each of us was trying to show how much more broad-minded we were than the next neighbor. That would have been the India that Rabindranath Tagore would have valued. I mean, we all recite from school days where the mind is without fear, where the head is held high, where knowledge is free. And yet, we don't want knowledge to be free, it seems, in a public space. And the narrow domestic, the encroachments of the narrow domestic walls on our intellectual freedom today.
Now, moving on to the future, I mean, you have, of course, sort of one of the, celebrated Twitterati of this country. Now, one wonders, and of course, you've been in trouble because of it as well. But one wonders whether Twitter will one day become a great literary form, and there'll be a literary meet with a group of Twitterati sitting around discussing their Twitters.
Well, actually, I think somebody has already published a book of Twitter short stories. In other words, each story is 140 characters long. And apparently some well-known writers have contributed to it. So, but obviously the great limitation of Twitter as an artistic form is length. I mean, haikus are short, yes, but tweets are 140 characters, which does not give you much space for literary expression. So I think that will always limit its effectiveness as a literary device.
You think they'll be called twits then?
That, I'm afraid, has been tried too often. I mean, the kinds of things that have been done with that. Today somebody came to me and I said, why haven't you tweeted about this festival? And she said, I'm a twergen.
Good God.
So I said, what does that make the rest of us? Twinfomaniacs.
Now, of course, the whole business of writing is moving on to all kinds of electronic devices of all kinds. And publishing itself is changing. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about how it changes the publishing industry. And of course, Penguin is now probably signing up with Random House and so on. Now, what does this do for writers? How does it change their lives?
Even the changes in the publishing industry?
Yes.
Well, the first good news in India is actually there's been a proliferation of publishers. When I first published my first book, Reasons of State, there was basically no good publisher in India. And I say this with the greatest respect. but the Indian publisher, I wanted the book to be published in India because it was quite critical of aspects of Indian foreign policy. And I didn't want reviewers to say, who's this fellow sitting abroad and criticizing our country? So I wanted it to be published in India. But the publisher, I found, did a pretty disastrous job at every stage of the process, from editing to typesetting. And when I corrected the proofs, there were about 10 mistakes per page, they then made mistakes in the corrections. So, I mean, to this day, this book, Reasons of State, exists with about 15 typos per page. I mean, that was the quality of publishing in those days. Then Penguin came. They were the first ones into the, who brought international standards into Indian publishing. And when I wrote the Great Indian Novel, they were the only international publisher in India, and I obviously offered it to them. Again, I wanted an Indian edition separate from the Western editions because I felt that, especially in those days, the conversion rate and our purchasing power in India being much lower, I knew that a book published, say, in London could never be affordable to, say, the college student in India whom I hope will read the Great Indian Novel. So when the book came out in London at £12.99, it was available 1 month later in India for 75 rupees. And that made a huge difference in terms of the reach of the book. But Penguin was the only one. Today, 20 years later, what is the Great Indian Novel was published in 89, so 23 years later, you are seeing a number of world-class publishers in India and a number of Indian publishers who themselves have met international standards of production quality, editorial quality, design quality. You hold a book in your hands from some of these Indian publishers just as good as anything you'd get from an international publisher. That has offered a tremendous range of options to Indian writers. And I think you've seen, therefore, a lot of Indian writers coming to the fore who've been first discovered and published by Indian publishers here. And that's been a very, very good development. Now, you talk about the consolidation of publishing houses, that would be seemingly a trend in the opposite direction. In other words, where you could choose...
self-publishing as something that kind of offsets that? Because, Amazon now says...
Self-publishing can work. Amish, who's going to be the next speaker on this podium, first self-published his book and self-marketed it. But it did so well that then a regular publisher took it on and republished it. And then his subsequent books have come through regular publication. So he is not the only one who started out that way, but he's certainly the most successful and the most visible of them. And that is an option. It certainly was not a credible option in the earlier days when, as it is, there was very little money in publishing. And self-publishing was therefore left to the very affluent. I would say that publishing on the whole is in healthy shape in India. India is the only country in the world where all forms of media are growing. You've got more newspapers being published every year, more magazines being, published every year, at a time when print publications in the Western world are actually shrinking and closing. You've got more television channels opening up, more FM radio stations, and more books being published. So every year the graph keeps going up. And since 25% of our population is yet to become literate, one can safely assume that that graph will continue to go up for another generation. So India may be the last refuge in the English-speaking world for talented editors, writers, journalists, and so on, because everywhere else that space is shrinking. India, it's still growing.
Now, I think we've got 25 minutes more to go, so why not open this up to the audience? I'm so sure there's a few thousand questions. Just a bit of housekeeping. Please keep the questions short and make sure that they are questions and not statements.
And do tell us who you are, since you know who I am.
So I'm Shyam Basu. I'm representing Calcutta University and covering this meet for my university. I've read somewhere that you read about 365 books in 365 days. So, I just can't even think of it. But then, my question to you is, if we read at that rate, can we really enjoy the essence or the subtext of the novel?
That's exactly right, and that's why I don't recommend it. It's one of those slightly silly childhood challenges you set yourself. I was 12 or 13, and I said, let me try and do this. And I kept a list, so I actually hit the 365 before Christmas. But sometimes I cheated by reading very slender books. And sometimes I read a lot of junk as well in the process. And I think you're right. If you're reading to a target, you deprive yourself of the sheer joy of reading, the sheer pleasure of reading. So I do not recommend it to anyone. It's simply a quirk. It happened. somebody found out about it. I may have mentioned it in an interview or something. And since then, it sort of entered the, what can I say, the publicly received wisdom about my slightly crazy literary life. But I would not recommend it anymore to anyone.
Yeah, next.
Good evening, sir. I'm Anutosh Kanode. I'm a student of architecture from the IIT. I wanted to ask you if the story about Charles is true, one. And secondly, I'm still waiting to hear what happened to his son.
Right. Well, Charles is partly true. It's a composite story. And in fact, the only editorial change made in the entire book from the moment I submitted the manuscript was to leave out the sentence in which I said, this story is fiction, but it is a composite of real events. Because somehow the publishers were convinced that would spoil the impact of the story. I think it was, I should not have given in on that point, and I regret doing so, because many people wrongly assume, for example, that I was called Neil as a child, because the character in the story through whom the narration is told is called Neil. The essence of the story is true in that I actually had this experience of visiting my ancestral home in a village in Kerala every year and seeing with my own eyes through my own growing up the evolution of caste discrimination. This child who initially couldn't play with us and a few years later was playing with us but couldn't come into the house, then could come into the house but was not invited to eat with us, then a few years later allowed to eat but sitting on the floor and eating off a leaf, and then a few years later wandering free in the house and through the kitchen. This person exists and his name is Charles. But this person went on to become a successful businessman rather than an IAS officer. There are other stories of Dalits who went on to become IAS officers and succeeded, and I've conflated these experiences to have a more, shall we say, creatively realized short story. And that is something that should have been acknowledged in the book, because when you throw a short story into a non-fiction book, you have an obligation to the readership to admit that. And anyway, now the book is more than 15 years old, so it's a bit late in the day to acknowledge it, but since you ask, it is actually fiction, but there is a strong kernel of truth. Almost every incident in the story is real, identities are disguised, and the character who becomes an IAS officer, most of the things that happen to him in the story happen to somebody who didn't become an IAS officer, but the experience is real, I hope.
Hi, my name is Shibnath Sen. I work for JWT as a creative director. I have a question that I used to read the Junior Statesman.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
I used to read the Junior Statesman as a teenager, yes?
Right.
And one of your most marvelous, utterly marvelous series were Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And you never talk about that. My question is...
That wasn't me.
Of course you...
No, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. I think I wrote one short story that was a parody of Sherlock Holmes, but the series, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, was by somebody else, and they were very good. Sherlock Holmes, I think, was called. Very, that wasn't me.
Oh, sorry, my question anything.
No, you were about to give me credit for somebody else's creativity.
No, I was about to ask you, can it be reincarnated?
No, it was a lot of fun. There were a number of young writers who somehow didn't persist from those days. And I remember a pair of young Bengali girls, Papia and Tuk Tuk Ghosh, who wrote a lot of stories. I can't remember if Sherlock Holmes was theirs, but certainly they wrote a number of stories. And somehow, one expected great things of them in later life and never happened. Tuk Tuk Ghosh is an IAS officer. Papia became a professor and was brutally murdered, very sadly, a few years ago. JS offered a sort of laboratory for the outlet, an outlet for creative expression that was not available anywhere else.
That's right.
The stories that JS published would not have made it to the Illustrated Weekly of India, which was the other major outlet. They carried 1 or 2 stories every week. But the stories that JS published would not have been in the weekly. I actually did have 1 or 2 stories in the weekly, and I consciously wrote for the weekly. It had to be a more sort of a serious style. Whereas JS allowed you a lot of liberty to fool around with language, with expression, with story. A lot more humor was carried. And I must say it was a terrific, terrific outlet. The one that I serialized was called Operation Bellows.
Yes,
and, all my early writing, as you'll see from the $5 Smile, was very influenced by my early reading. That's how writers learn their craft. No one ever taught me to write. I learned by writing. And inevitably, your early writing is derivative. My first unpublished stories were very much like the Enid Blyton stories I was reading as a child. She had her 5 find-outers and her famous 5 and her secret 7. So I invented the 6 solvers, who were 6 Indian kids doing similar sorts of things, and that was never published anywhere. But then from there, I read the Biggles books. I don't know, any of you still read Biggles books? Great adventure. And so I invented an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Bellows. And there he went off and fought World War II and sort of defeated the Nazis single-handedly, more or less. And that was what was serialized in the Junior Statesman, apart from individual stories, but that was the only serial I kept.
I have one question actually after this. Now, I think humor is a huge strong point of yours. And now that you're a politician, you must be copiously taking notes of what is happening where, you know. So do you think there's a chance of seeing Yes Prime Minister years down the line from you?
I enjoyed Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. And I gather there was subsequently an Indian version in Hindi of Yes Minister. So clearly a lot of the lessons and a lot of the practices of our bureaucracy resonated across the divide. But the truth is that humor is much easier outside political life than it is in political life. As I discovered in some of my early, very innocent tweets, you're very liable to be misinterpreted in a political context in which people are looking to take offense. And when, for example, a journalist, a Bengali journalist as it happens, asked me, so Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class? And I, having lived 35 years in the West, where that's a very banal and routine expression for economy class, and it's not meant to insult the passengers, but to insult the airlines for herding us in like cattle. So I replied, yes, in cattle class, out of solidarity with all our holy cows. I got hit upon like a ton of bricks. And I had failed to realize, A, that our political life has not much room for humor. B, that when it's translated into Bengali and Marathi and Hindi and Malayalam, it sounds awful like this snooty minister, you know, disparaging economy class travelers as cattle. And I recalled and remembered the wisdom of Shakespeare's line 400 years ago, that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. So until the hearers develop ears more finely tuned to humor, I may have to bite my tongue a little more often.
Good evening, sir. I just wanted to, in reference to this, in Bookless in Baghdad, I remember you wrote that you're a great fan of Woodhouse, which, and I believe you were the president of some Woodhousean club.
I revived the Woodhouse Society. The first
yes.
one in the world was at St. Stephen's College.
Oh, yes. So my question is...
And I'm a patron, by the way, of the Global Woodhouse Society in London.
That's right. I think you mentioned that too. So my question is, how much of the humor of Woodhouse do you still retain? And does it still help you get through difficult situations, as you're very often put under and put into? Does the humor of Woodhouse still help you get through these?
Very much. I mean, except for one thing, which is that the influence is no longer recent. I finished all of Woodhouse's 95 books by the time I was 19 years old. And simply because there is so much more to read and so much less time to read in adult life, I have reread very few, maybe 3 or 4 at most, have been reread once in the 4 decades almost since then. So the lines, the humor are not fresh except what I remember. And I do remember many, many things. And I loved his good-humored subversion of the English language. And that subversive sense of humor, I think I very much acquired from reading Woodhouse. But you're right that it's difficult to find space for it much. In my fiction, there is humor, but it's not very Woodhouseian. There is one scene, though, that I'm very proud of in the great Indian novel, a scene in which the Mahaguru Gangaji goes to have tea with the Viceroy, which is a scene that is very strongly influenced by Woodhouseian use of language. And those of you who haven't read the great Indian novel, and those of you who have it already, could go and look at that scene. It occurs in the first third of the book. And you'll find that there is still that influence, but obviously in my later writing, very, very much less of it. in Bookless in Baghdad, there is an entire chapter on Woodhouse.
Yes, there is.
Why I think Woodhouse is still admired in India.
And does humor help you get through your difficult times? That is what I really wanted to know.
Sorry, does it help me get through?
Does, you know, all the difficult times that you have to go through, the difficult things, well, for example, cattle class, all those things, does humor help you kind of take a different view?
There was a
Look at it differently.
There was a time when perhaps I would have simply sought refuge in a Woodhouse book in the moment of crisis. Sadly, you know, again, one hasn't had the time to do that. But I'm sure that having been able, through exposure to a good-humored writer like Woodhouse, to be able to discover the capability of looking at the world with drollery, with amusement, with a faint sense of the ridiculous, that did, I suppose, at some subconscious level, help me get through the West.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
We have time for actually quite a few.
But we started about 10 minutes later.
Yeah, so we can keep going. Yeah,
till
we
then,
we have time for quite a few.
Lots of hands up.
Hello, sir.
Whoever has the mic, sir. Yeah. We're not selecting. The young lady there is one eye you have to catch.
Hello, sir. So I'm Aditya Kuhar from St. Xavier's College. So apart from being a writer, you're also a politician. So I just wanted to know, what is your take on the cultural terrorism, be it the Vishwarupam film or the banning of Salman Rushdie from even this meet, apart from the Jaipur Literary Festival? And as you already said that we've been culturally intolerant, how do you wish to play a role as a politician, as a congressman, to do this? And this despite being also a part of the Congress culture as well. Thank you.
Well, I don't think there's any point speaking of a particular party. This is, as I said, an era of various segments of society claiming the right to be offended and obliging the rest of us to pay attention to their sense of offense. And that cuts across political lines between state governments and central governments. It's a nationwide phenomenon. And I have to say that it worries me very greatly. Even though I am a minister in the government, and that obviously imposes certain restraints on how much I can say, as a writer, I want to say that one of the greatest strengths of our civilization has been the ability to watch culture evolve through the expression of heretical views. I mean, the Bengal Renaissance would not have been possible without views challenging the prevailing orthodox wisdom of the time. A government's duty, whether a state government or a central government, is to uphold the law and the constitution. That we must do. But if the law, for example, provides for a censor board to decide whether a film offends certain social sensibilities, whether it must be cut, and so on, and then the censor board issues a certificate for a film to be released, it worries me that that can then be second-guessed by intolerant behavior of certain groups. Of course, in the particular case of the film you mentioned, the matter is sub judice, and the judiciary has its own role in our constitution, which I am not challenging. We will have to await the judiciary's wisdom on these matters. But as a general proposition, the government's job is not to restrict the avenue for freedom of expression, but to uphold the freedom of expression enshrined in the Constitution within the limits also prescribed in the Constitution. Now, one of those limits, we don't have absolute freedom as the Americans do in their Constitution. One of the limits is indeed a danger to public order, to law and order. That is written into the article in the Constitution that gives us the freedom of expression. Now, each state government has to make a judgment in each case as to whether law and order is seriously threatened by a particular form of cultural expression. Now, I would prefer that governments err as far as possible on the side of creative freedom, whereas what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years is, for the most part, governments of all stripes, perhaps playing it safe politically, are erring on the side of those who claim to be offended. Now, there is a real problem there. On the one hand, if you're worried that a particular thing that is legally published or filmed or screened or whatever is going to incite a particular group to violence, then isn't that group itself wrong to threaten violence? That's against the law, isn't it? I mean, they have a constitutional right to hold a dharna, or hold up placards, or make other peaceful, non-violent objections to a particular film or book. That is their right. But they have no right to throw bombs or stones or knives or attack people or threaten to attack people in places. So shouldn't the government be defending those people in places against those who threaten violence? Then comes the practical question. We've just had a statement from Chief Minister Jayalalitha pointing out that if you look at the number of screens in which Vishwarupam was to be screened, and the number of policemen available to the state of Tamil Nadu, it would not have been physically possible to protect every theatre. Now, this is a kind of law and order judgment that a chief minister administering a state has to make. So all of these calculations it's not a simple issue. There is an obligation to uphold the law and the constitution. There is an obligation to maintain law and order and public order. There is a judgment to be made between your ability to uphold the law, protect people and creative freedom, and perhaps your physical limitations and how much you can do to protect it, and the degree of anger that a particular thing might generate. And all of these calculations are being made by governments in this. Sometimes many of us feel that the calculations are ones we might disagree with, particularly when we see certain books, films, television shows, and so on being challenged, when those offended have every right not to watch them, not to read them, not to buy them, or to boycott them very publicly, to make their protests known, and the world would have gone on. Certainly, that would have been my preference, but we live in a society where such things have happened in the past, where protests on various issues have actually escalated into violence and loss of life. So you can't entirely blame the government, the police, the law and order machinery for being conscious of these dangers as well. It's a really tough line to walk on.
Mr. Tharoor, may I have your attention? In the front row, yeah, just to, youngsters to become a good call center worker or agent. The point, you see, we in the call center, try to, the first thing is to establish a harmonious relation between customer and the, agent. And then only, try to see that he buys something. Now, you've been a wonderful champion, of peace and understanding between countries, and you have a very wide universal outlook on humanity, in general. That's what I feel, And being dedicated to your patriotism to India also, you see, the point here is that how difficult it becomes for you sometimes when you see yourself as an international citizen, you see, as a human rights champion, and then, fall back on your patriotism, how difficult it becomes. That's question number one. And the other thing is the recent skirmish which took place in the Kashmir border, and that created a lot of, problems for those who were championing the cause of peace, and the artists, the singers, the musicians, we were all trying to bring the good people together, the civil rights movement, till, this whole big thing was blown up, and it's caused a lot of strains, and so I'd like your views, please.
Well, on the question of the border with Kashmir, we are living in an era where the media is a very significant player in determining any government's policy options. And that is a reflection of our democracy and the extent to which a democratic government is obliged to be responsive to public pressure. So when this incident occurred on the border, and it got leaked, because of course in this very hothouse media environment, it's very easy for even a mid-ranking army officer to call a friend in the media or call a friend who has a friend in the media saying, this happened, and for the whole thing to simply go viral. When a story like this leaked, it became impossible for the government to continue its far-sighted pursuit of peace at that moment, because when you have daily images of a mother wailing saying, I want my son's head back, and you have politicians saying, get 10 heads from the other side to make up for the one we've lost, and this sort of extraordinary frothing at the mouth that was taking place in the country, it naturally created an atmosphere within which proceeding ahead, for example, with the agreed visa liberalization policy would have seemed completely tone deaf in terms of the public mood and the public perception. And so our government had no real choice, it seems to me, but to put the brakes on what happened, to signal that business as usual was not possible, and at the same time to say that, look, as far as we are concerned as a government, we believe that Pakistan has to behave itself. And indeed, there's been a very significant dialing down of the temperature by the Pakistani side, which has enabled a period of calmness since that incident, which we hope will once again enable us to return to the path of peace. But I want to stress that I believe our government's diagnosis that in the longer term, peace is in our interest, in our national interest, is fundamentally accurate. Because our overriding national priority is the growth and development of our country, our economy, the abolition of poverty in our country. And to do that, you don't want the albatross of a permanently hostile neighbor, the threat of eruption of conflict at any time. Investors don't like to come into war zones, and you desperately need investment. So you have every interest in ensuring a peaceful atmosphere within which you can grow and your people can grow and prosper. And so if that is your objective, you have every responsibility as a government to pursue peace and keep your eye on that bigger picture. When incidents like this happen, they may be temporarily putting a brake on the process, even derailing the process slightly. But if your eye is on the destination, you want to get back on track as soon as possible. So you don't have a mic, so nobody can hear what you're saying. It's not fair to the others.
Sure, yeah.
Hi, my name is Abhinav Bhatt. I'm from IIM Calcutta. And basically, what is your take on the kind of creative condescension that, some intelligentsia feel towards the more pulpy kind of novels as pioneered by Chetan Bhagat? And what is your take on the effect that they have had on India's youth, on introducing reading to the masses, I would rather say?
Look, I actually have a very open-minded attitude. I've reviewed Chetan Bhagat. In fact, if you'll go and Google my review of Chetan Bhagat's last novel, Revolution 2020, you will see my analysis of why he matters. And to a great extent, people like Chetan Bhagat and Shobha De and so on are writing books that are read by people who would not be reading the more serious literary fiction of the Amitav Ghoshes or the Manu Chatterjees or whatever. These are not the same readers. They've actually opened the space to new readers, often from smaller towns, from people who have done some English medium studies, but for whom English is very much a second language. They write in a vocabulary, in a style that relates to people very different from those who read and appreciate the kinds of more serious literary writers that perhaps most of you in a literary fair would be thinking about. And I welcome that because part of the growth of literature and writing in a country like India must include the democratization of the space. They also write about subjects that the literary writers have not been writing about. And as a result, again, they open up the space. Again, Amish is coming up here. He's the first one to take mythology and essentially make of it popular fiction in a way that reached a record number of readers that the literary writers have not been able to reach. So you must understand that books and writing, in my view, in a mature literary culture, should span the entire range. We should have rom-coms, romantic comedies, chick lit, all of these terms, pulp fiction, thrillers. Why shouldn't we have good thrillers in India? If English and American fiction can thrive on that too, we should have good thrillers coming out here, as well as serious literary novels, aspiring novels, novels that aspire for the Booker and the Nobel and so on. Let's have all of that. But let's have the entire range. If English is, as I believe it is, a valid form, a valid vehicle for the expression of India's creative sensibilities, then it must embrace that entire span of India's sensibilities.
Good evening, sir. At the back, at the back. My name is Joanna. I'm a law student, and I'll begin by saying it's a great honor to have you here in the city.
Thank you.
And my question to you is very, very simple, and it's a little off the hook. I'll begin by saying you're very, very handsome. We were not being allowed because there was no place, and I know me and a few other girls, we were just jumping on our toes just to catch a glimpse of your face.
My parents get all the credit. I had nothing to do with it.
I just wanted to know something little personal. My mom is a huge fan of yours. She's not yet come, but she's like, Shashi Tharoor is so handsome. So I just wanted to ask, you are very good looking. I want to know a personal question. I want to know...
Sorry, the laughter is drowning out your question.
How did you cope up with female fan following? Was it very tiresome, maybe exciting? I don't know, maybe just a little bit personal. We read about all your political works on the papers and things. I wanted to know this personal question, please.
No, but I didn't hear the last bit you said, but the question, how do I cope with the female following, is I embrace it, but not them. No, look, you write in order to be read. And it's delightful to be read by people of both genders. Even though my writing may not have a particular appeal to a gender, if the jacket photograph will get some women to read my books, I'm not going to complain. But jokes apart, you know, I know you had your tongue firmly in your cheek. What's refreshing about your question is, you know, women writers often object to being subject to the male gaze. It's good once in a while for the tables to be turned on male writers.
Good evening, sir.
Where is yeah.
Sir, I'm a student from IIT Kharagpur, and I want to ask you a question that I myself I write in Hindi. I write poetry in Hindi, but I read in English. And I know that it's ironical kind of for me also. And being an engineering student also, someday I want to become a writer. But I want to be a writer in Hindi. And personally, I don't feel myself that there is a room for Hindi writers, because even I myself read in Hindi, so I know that the readers prefer English reading. So I want to ask your take on the fact that is there a room for writers other than language in English?
Very much so. And in fact, I think you're wrong to say there isn't room. First of all, your own experience is in a very fine literary tradition. One of our great Hindi writers, Nirmal Verma, was a professor of English. You are Anantamurthy, who writes in Kannada, head of the Department of English at his university. So you've got a lot of people who were deeply immersed in English language and English writing and English literature, but which may have shaped their sensibility, but who express themselves in their mother tongue that they feel most comfortable as a vehicle for their expression. So you stand in that tradition. If you're reading in English and writing poetry in Hindi, that's fine. But I would also urge you to read poetry in Hindi, written by others, so you have a sense of what is already being done with the potential of the language in poetry. Otherwise, you might be under the impression that what you're doing in Hindi somehow overcomes, you know, which reflects what you've read in English, overcomes something that perhaps has already been tried in Hindi. The second point is that there is increasing interest in Indian writing cutting across the linguistic divide. I remember 20 years ago when I first started telling my French and German publishers who were asking me about Indian writers that they could translate, I used to ask them point blank, you know, there's a limited number of Indian writers in English, but if the books are going to be read in French or German, how does it matter if they were written in English? Translate good Hindi novels, Bengali novels, Malayalam novels, and you will still essentially be giving people a translated work. Now, the only technical problem there was that, of course, for a German publisher or a French publisher, getting people who were sufficiently aware of their language and Hindi and Malayalam and Tamil, that was more of a challenge. And therefore, often translations went through the intermediary of English books, and only those Hindi writers who had already been translated into English got a chance to have international exposure. But at our national level, the readership in Hindi is shooting up. Newspapers have already changed. When I was a kid in India, the #1 circulation newspapers in India were in Bengali, Malayalam, and English. Today, all three languages have been overtaken by Hindi. If you look at the circulation of newspapers, more Hindiwalas are reading newspapers than any other linguistic group in India. Okay? And that is a reflection of the increasing rates of literacy in the Hindi belt, which were very low earlier, and at the same time, the fact that there is more being published for them. So you are actually at the right age, at the right time. There are more readers available, there are more outlets available, there are more publishers available. You'll do fine.
Shashi, Shashi, the organizers are waving at me, so two more. I think two more we can do. So definitely.
Namaskaram, sir.
Namaskaram.
Apni kemon achen?
Bhalo achi, I think. Thank you.
So with no intention to embarrass you and rather embarrass myself, I have two straight questions, rather yes or no types. The first one, are we going to get the pleasure of a book signing session later this evening?
Yes, yes, I think there is some books right behind.
Right next door at the bookshop, yep.
I think
right
the
away.
bookshop.
Okay.
Immediately
behind,
after.
Immediately behind.
And my second question, with due respect to Sunanda madam, sir,
I didn't hear that, sir.
with due respect to Sunanda madam.
Do I? Do I respect Sunanda?
No,
With
no,
due
no,
respect.
no, no.
Yes, I respect Sunanda.
No, sir, that was not my question.
Give my respects to Sunanda.
Oh, give your respects to Sunanda.
No.
The acoustics aren't great. Tell us again.
Sir, with due respect to Sunanda, madam, it's rather a request. May I take that water bottle away?
He wants to take that water bottle away because...
Please.
All yours.
Thank you.
There's not much left though.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, sir, you didn't ask for my name?
I'm sorry, the sound is really...
You did not ask for my name? Well, you can call me your devotee. Shashi's devotee.
You can call her?
You can call me your devotee.
A devotee, okay, thank you so much. Khub bhalo laglo, dhanyabad. One talking about has some humorous stories and some very serious and emotional ones. Great Indian Novel was a satirical novel. Show Business continued in the same tradition. Riot was a totally serious book. So I've tried to experiment in my own writing with different forms and different sensibilities depending on the subject. All my non-fiction is in fact by and large rather straight-laced because I've tried to write what I suppose would be called conventional non-fiction. I've not tried too many experiments with form other than the experiment of putting in that Charles story in India from Midnight to the Millennium. Otherwise my non-fiction has been fairly straight. So in fact, if you look at my body of work over these 46 years, you will actually find much less humor than perhaps they should be ideally to please my readers. But I do see myself as a human being with a number of responses to the world, some of which I manifest in my work, some of which I manifest in my writing. And in my writing, some of which seems to me to call for a humorous or satirical take, and some of which calls for a straightforward, dead-eyed, serious look at the issues it throws up. So to my mind, being able to do both is essential. Certainly the novel I was planning to start when I became a minister was not planned to be a humorous novel. But I would hate to be saying that I will never go back to humor. I may well want to write something funny later. But humor and satire have their place. I think particularly in a mature literature, they're as important. And by the way, there's a great tradition of that in Sanskrit literature, in Greek literature. These are not necessarily just postmodernist ideas. They're very much there anchored in most literary cultures, and we should have them in ours too. Thank you all very much. You've been a great audience.
Excellent.